To what extent is sexual orientation a genetic trait? Human behaviour is extremely complex, and there are very few, if any, behaviours that can be attributed to genetics alone. There are usually a range of factors determining behaviour, including genetics, environmental factors, and social factors, conditions even in the womb. It's rarely possible in the case of human beings, unlike, say, fruit flies, to be able to carry out manipulative experiments. We can't raise several generations of human beings in the lab. Studies of human behaviour are therefore observational, often using, for instance, identical twins as experimental subjects. The question of sexual orientation is a particularly tricky one because of ideological convictions on both sides of the debate. It may be a particularly difficult issue about which to maintain scientific objectivity. If I were to make an a priori guess about this one, based on studies of other kinds of human behaviour, I would guess that sexual orientation will be the result of an interaction between several factors, genetic factors among them. What percentage or proportion can be attributed to genetics will probably be the question that most studies try to answer. Questions such as whether genetics is a sufficient and/or necessary condition for sexual orientation may be interesting, but I wonder if they can ever be answered definitively. Various sides of the ideological divide may be inclined to cherry-pick the studies that support their particular view. I'm hoping to avoid that, so I actually went to ChatGPT in search of some relevant scientific studies. I first asked it this question: what scientific evidence is there that sexual preference is genetically determined? Please point me in the direction of some scientific papers that address this issue. And it spat out a number of papers for me to look at. I realise, though, that the way I phrased that question may already have biased the search towards certain papers that yielded positive results. So I also asked this question: what scientific evidence is there that sexual preference is not genetically determined? Please point me in the direction of some scientific papers that address this issue. Again, though, having asked that question, I realised that it's much more difficult to establish a negative result than a positive result. And the papers that this generated, in fact, didn't exclude a genetic component, but simply pointed out that other factors were also important. I don't think that anyone in the scientific community would argue that sexual orientation is entirely determined by genetics. The debate will be about the relative contribution of this and other factors. Even left-handedness is not entirely genetically determined, so it's extremely unlikely that something as complicated as sexual orientation is going to be entirely down to the genes. I should also emphasise that this is a very different question from whether or not sexual orientation can be regarded as a choice. The alternative is not genetics or a choice. Many aspects of human behaviour are not entirely genetically determined, but it would be foolish to think that they were therefore entirely down to a free choice. To keep with the left-handed, right-handed example, even if someone is left or right-handed despite their genes, this does not mean that they chose to be left or right-handed, or that they can simply choose to be otherwise. Whatever other factors contributed to their left or right orientation, these were just as deterministic as the genetics. It wasn't a choice. They couldn't simply have chosen otherwise. And why should they anyway? Now, I hope you don't think that this is a trivial example. It isn't. If this is true of something as seemingly straightforward as left or right-handedness, how much more likely is it to be true of something as complicated as sexual orientation? So sexual orientation is almost certainly down to a combination of genetic and environmental factors. This doesn't mean that it's simply a choice that can be undone, and it most certainly does not mean that it's a choice that should be undone. There's no reason to regard it as a disorder of either a psychological or moral nature, nor does one's particular religious convictions have any bearing on the science. So what do the studies actually indicate? Well, it gets very complicated. Some of the science is very complicated and some of it's beyond me. And also it's difficult to access the full text of some of these papers. All that's available publicly is the abstract. But one of the earliest studies, and I'll leave a list of these journal articles in the description below, but one of the earliest of the studies was brought out in 1991, a genetic study of male sexual orientation. And I should point out that much of this work has actually been done on male sexual orientation rather than female sexual orientation. And this was a twins study, as many of them are. So it compared identical twins, monozygotic twins, with fraternal twins, dizygotic twins, and also adoptive, so unrelated, brothers. It's worth pointing out that in their search for subjects, they didn't distinguish between people who identified as homosexual and those who identified as bisexual. And also note that this monozygotic versus dizygotic status of twins wasn't determined genetically, but on the basis of other characteristics, such as whether these two were often mistaken for each other. So there always will be questions about methodology in studies like this, and there were criticisms of this study later along those lines. But the results of the study anyway were that 25 out of 56, or 52%, of monozygotic twins who were homosexual, in those cases their brothers were also homosexual. So in 52% of cases. In the case of dizygotic twins or fraternal twins, it was 12 out of 54. And in the case of adopted brothers, it was 6 out of 57. That's 52%, 22%, and 11%. And they found that this was statistically significant between the identical twins and the fraternal twins, and the identical twins and the adopted brothers. In other words, if one monozygotic twin was homosexual or bisexual, there was a significantly greater chance that their brother would also be homosexual than in the case of the dizygotic or fraternal twins, or in the case of the adopted brothers. The authors claim that the difference between dizygotic brothers and adopted brothers was marginally significant, but I think that's fudging it a bit. I would say that it was not significant. Now, some of the stats get beyond me here, but in summary, they did find, using various methods and making various assumptions, that there was a significant degree of heritability with respect to sexual orientation. The extent of that depended on what assumptions were made, but in all cases it was significantly heritable. So that does indicate some significant genetic component to whether or not a person was homosexual or not. Much more recently, in 2000, one of these authors conducted a much larger study on twins, and in that study they found the heritability of sexual orientation was less clear-cut. It was more difficult to entangle from environmental effects. So you can see how difficult this is. They did find, however, that childhood gender nonconformity, in other words, children who didn't conform to the standards that we expect of boys or girls at that age, that this characteristic, childhood gender nonconformity, was actually significantly heritable in both sexes. This was a study of both males and females. The scale used for measuring sexual orientation is called the Kinsey scale. And when using this scale for measuring sexual orientation, men were actually much more likely to identify as exclusively homosexual with a high score of 5 to 6, while women were more likely to have slight to moderate scores of 1 to 3, meaning that they had slight to moderate homosexual feelings. And the authors of the paper do also suggest that maybe the mechanisms determining sexual orientation may be different in men and women, and that different study approaches may be required. A paper from 1993 was more concerned with identifying specific genes that play a role in determining sexual orientation. And just briefly, they actually found a maternal but not paternal link between relatives as far as sexual orientation is concerned. In other words, they found a genetic component on the X chromosome in homosexual men. Now, this result has not been fully replicated since then, or at least the results have been mixed, but a 2015 paper did give support for this genetic linkage on the X chromosome as well as on chromosome number 8. And a more recent study from 2019 found that sexual orientation or sexual behaviour is influenced by a whole range of genes. And in this one, they used several hundred thousands of full genotypes to test for a genome-wide association. I will just say that sometimes huge studies are not that useful. When you have a massive sample size, you increase the likelihood of finding statistically significant associations which are not in fact of any practical consequences. For example, with a big enough study, you might find that preference for eating sushi increases with height. If you have a sample of several hundred thousand, you might find a result like that. They might have demonstrated, for example, that for every 20 centimetre increase in height, preference for sushi increased by 0.02%. But that's a significant statistical result. But in reality, to detect any difference in people's actual behaviour or in, for example, sales of sushi, you would have to be comparing people who were 1 metre tall with people who were 10 metre tall to actually notice any difference. So the result can be statistically significant, but can be really irrelevant in the real world. So I'd be wary of massive studies. Bigger is not always better. Both small and excessively large sample sizes are better avoided in favour of the middle ground somewhere. In that middle ground, any significant result you get in your study is more likely to have some real-life consequences. I think from looking at all these and other studies and at various summaries of research in the area, it's fair to say this. It's clear that several genes on several chromosomes contribute somewhat to sexual orientation, in conjunction with each other and with other factors such as environmental factors. It's extremely unlikely that there is a particular gay gene or any single combination that results in homosexuality. I think at this stage we're unable to say that any of these genes on their own or in combination are either a necessary or sufficient cause for determining sexual orientation. In other words, people with these various combinations may identify as heterosexual, and people without these genetic combinations, all or some of them, may identify as homosexual. Remember, this is all about statistics and likelihood. People with some or all of these genetic markers are more likely to identify as homosexual than people without them. Clearly, other non-genetic factors enter into this, as indeed may other genetic factors that have yet to be identified. Once again, though, I emphasise that people who identify as homosexual without these genetic markers cannot be said to have simply chosen to be gay. Factors other than simply the given genes of a person clearly play a role. For example, the release of certain hormones at crucial times of development while still in the womb. These also probably play a significant role in determining sexual orientation. And of course, environmental factors may play a role after birth. All of these, though, may be just as deterministic as the effects of genes. I reiterate this because I think it's very important. This question cannot be reduced to the simple dichotomy of genetic, therefore no choice on the one hand, and not genetic, therefore choice on the other.